When searching for criticisms of America's founding fathers, you'll often find lame trivia of family drama between descendants and wealth, some unnecessary fact about how the author of the Constitution's preamble killed himself with a whale bone in his genitals, and at best, how most of them owned slaves. But hidden away from modern American education is the sheer uncredited appropriation from the founding fathers as a whole. Britannica also fails to recognize this by declaring that the Founding Fathers were responsible for the successful war for colonial independence from Great Britain, the liberal ideas celebrated in the Declaration of Independence, and the Republican form of government defined in the United States Constitution. This is just plain wrong. And by the end of the video, I'll explain how the Founding Fathers were frauds, how the basis of Western society was founded by Native Americans, and how much of the history we know had been shaped to cover it up. But I must make it clear that my critique here isn't about taking inspirations from the past. It is instead about taking credit for inspirations and trying to destroy the evidence. Such a thing is on the level of Nazis, appropriating symbols from Asiatic and Nordic cultures. Even conservatives who defend copyrights and private properties should agree with me here, which the Founding Fathers are in this case hardly different. Let's start from the beginning. Just who were the Founding Fathers? Before Great Britain and Parliament rattled the chains that enslaved Americans and gained the vexation of those seeking liberty, there was another class of individuals better suited and far more deserving of the ire of the American masses. Our Founding Fathers. They were the wealthy absentee landowners, monopolist merchants, and traders in cahoots with corrupt political dynasties who shared the spoils and opportunities of development. They were colonial Americans who, through the luck of being related to those who first arrived from Europe and grabbed the most land for themselves, or by thrift, greed, and shrewd business dealings, were part of what in modern terms we label the top 1%. This coming from author and historian Harry Chenoweth. The American Revolutionary War did not start because of religious freedom seekers and British tax haters, but because of the actions of greedy elites who hypocritically had financial relationships with British governors, parliamentary lords, ministers, and merchants. This might be new to many Americans now, but back then, these elites were the target of much of the working class, with protests, hostilities, and outright riots, all reminiscent of what occurred in France decades later. So before the revolts against the British, there were revolts against the colonial heads by the average British American settler, from protests against New York and South Carolina landowners in the 1760s, to the tenants' revolts in 1766, and the farmers' regulator movement in 1768. The Red Scare back then wasn't the Redcoats. No, it was our Founding Fathers fearing the loss of their king-given lands. So to prevent a Viva la Revolution from happening in the colonies, the elites shifted the blame onto England in perfect and typically American false flag fashion. Two opposing forces met on May 15th. A heated battle lasted throughout the day, in which the Regulators were defeated. One of the supposed leaders of the Regulators was captured and executed on the spot. 6 others were captured and executed days later. Since the operation was handled by the royal governor, he, and England, ultimately received the wrath and blame for the violence. Not so the local colonial leaders who had financed the governor's militia. They went unscathed. Later, these same councilmen would be those who cried the loudest against England's strong-armed rule over their colony. And it's with this that a war ensued between Whigs and Tories before even the Revolutionary War. Another cause of the colonial elite's wrath was the Proclamation of 1763. The British Empire had just engaged in the French-Indian War, and thus did not want to provoke any native nations further. This proclamation reserved the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, which in turn blocked potential for landowners to expand to the west. This is obvious when taking a look at the various changes made against King George III written in the Declaration of Independence, such as, and I quote, "King George III endeavored to prevent the population of these states." The colonialists that partook in the French and Indian War saw great value in the Native Americans, who served as scouts and launched raids upon colonial frontiers. But that was as far as the respect went, because another charge against the king was that he, and I quote, "endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages." And remember, we're talking about the very people who joined armies of militiamen, laying siege to Boston in 1775. That's like calling Ukrainians savage for defending against the Russian invasion. But calling the natives savage was hardly justifiable, as I couldn't say it better than American anthropologist Lewis H. Morgan. Native men and women were equals. There was no private property. There was common holding of resources. Then a revolutionary return on a higher level to what we once were becomes possible as part of our human nature. This peace was only broken when the white men came into play. The Cherokee Nation was split between a faction that supported the colonialists and another that sided with Britain. The Iroquois Confederacy, an alliance of 6 Native American nations in New York, was divided by the Revolutionary War. 2 of the nations, the Oneida and Tuscarora, chose to side with the Americans, while the other nations, including the Mohawk, fought with the British. Hundreds of years of peaceful coexistence and cooperation between the 6 nations came to an end, as warriors from different nations fought one another on Revolutionary War battlefields. The British lost 13 colonies, but the Native Americans lost everything, and on top of that loss, like salt on a wound, is the lack of credit whatsoever. The conclusions of the Revolutionary War allowed colonial elites the ability to carve up Native American territories, which they'd wanted all along, and to create a new government, not like the monarchy they've now dedicated to disliking. They looked towards the Haudenosaunee Confederation's Great Law of Peace. The outcome of this appropriation was the Articles of Confederation, something framers like Benjamin Franklin to James Madison took credit for while calling the sources of their inspiration savages, like Benjamin's letter of 1751. It would be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such an union, and be able to execute it in such a manner that it has subsisted ages and appears dissoluble, and yet that, like a union, should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies to whom it is more necessary and must be more advantageous, and who cannot be supposed to want an equal understanding of their interests. What Benjamin Franklin failed to consider as to why the Haudenosaunee Confederation was so successful and the Articles of Confederation was not, was quite literally the colonialist keeping of capitalism. We're talking about the very elites who already profited with the British aristocrats years prior, so of course having profit-driven liberal states united only in aesthetic and name led to a corrupt mess with economic infighting. In all seriousness, the Founding Fathers basically founded anarcho-capitalism. And rather than rejecting capitalism as the problem, they reformed the government into the shitfest it is now. Likely for a chance at peace and changing white man's horrible ways, the Haudenosaunee, among other native people, were present at the Albany Congress, who introduced to them the ideas of the states joining together in the first place. You had the Cherokee chiefs having dinner with Thomas Jefferson's father in Williamsburg, and then in the northern area, of course, you had this Philadelphia interaction with the Delaware and the Iroquois, says Kirk Kickenbird, a representative of the Kiowa tribe. Yet people act like what united the states together instead was Benjamin Franklin's silly join-or-die cartoon. To the colonialists, the natives explained how the state congresses worked, how to do it with the separation of power and state, and demonstrated their ideas that we now call freedom of speech. Basically, all of these things are now credited to the founders. Most white historians know this information, and yet it is still not talked about openly, let alone in American schools. The only thing the colonialists didn't appropriate from the Native Americans was the right for equitable distribution of wealth, something we see in the top 50 flourishing countries in terms of life expectancy, which the US is not a part of. When early English explorer Henry Hudson first sailed up the Hudson River, he was confused, because what he encountered on the banks of the river was not dissimilar to Europe in regards to large-scale agriculture. Until he encountered the natives in that area, he was beginning to think they had stumbled upon a lost European colony. In fact, similar accounts and the fact that Huron, Algonquin, and Iroquois all used a multi-field rotation to increase crop yield and maintain the soil, some Europeans began thinking that Europeans had to have landed in the New World pre-Columbus, aside from the Norse, who did not have multi-field crop rotation systems. This eventually led to many of the conspiracy theories we have today about Irish monks or Roman legionaries landing in the New World and spreading their wisdom among the savages, because there was just no way that they came up with it on their own. The colonialists, and even some historians to this day, have been so bigoted in their thinking that they failed to comprehend how Native Americans could be so advanced without white man's superior civilization. Not only is credit to the natives long overdue, but the United States continue to show their thanks by subjugating and erasing Native Americans, who are rarely even mentioned in modern media, except when one bangs a drum at a stupid white kid for several minutes. Instead, we have rich old dudes who take the credit and are wrongfully celebrated every year, whose faces have been carved into the Sioux people's desecration at Mount Rushmore, and where we show our thanks to the planet with tons of polluting fireworks. This has been the Founding Fathers Funded Nothing. If you liked this video or learned something new, leave a like. If you didn't, then leave a dislike. Subscribe for more content like this.